Hello, my name is Teresa Smith, and I am the museum supervisor here at the Pemberton Museum. Today I'll be reading Cattle Drives and Perseverance from Pemberton, The History of a Settlement, published in 1977. Not many years after the departure of all or most of the few lingering post-gold rush settlers, new settlers arrived in Pemberton. By 1900, several had established themselves and would remain despite isolation, floods, and mosquitoes. They knew that the land was good, and it must have looked forward to the time when additional settlement would induce those with financial or political power to convert the trails into roads. While these men worked and planned, some of them provided for themselves and chance visitors a few essential services like stopping houses and stores. The new settlers included John Curry, whose name had appeared earlier on the Lillooet tax roll, but not until 1885 with a Pemberton address. With his partners, Dugald MacDonald and Owen Williams, he held 960 acres on which he pastured a number of hogs, cattle, and horses. In 1888, Curry and MacDonald applied for a survey of district lots 164 and 165, an area including the present secondary school site and extending south beyond the line where trains would be running 26 years later. In 1890, a surveyor, William Allen, described the preemptive holdings as well improved with splendid buildings. In the year that Curry and his partner made their application, Salvis Petit applied for surveyed district lot 166, land extending north from the present shore property and including the present Summerskill farm. The following year, G.W. Terry applied for survey land near Miller Creek. William Vader had probably settled in the early 80s, taking over the pool place and building the first section of the second halfway house on the portage. In 1881, a barn he had built without nails sheltered 25 cows and 2 horses. There are several reasons for the sudden desire to acquire land in a remote valley, but the interest could have been developing since 1886, when the first passenger train reached Fort Moody, and when every train brought new settlers. Dealing in land and timber, many Vancouver residents quickly became wealthy. Rail transportation opened up new resources, and interest grew in opening up still more wealth with railway lines. To encourage the building of new systems, the provincial government offered land, timber, and mineral rights to prospective builders, and before 1913, not surprisingly, the legislature had approved 211 railway schemes. In 1851, at the age of 17, John Curry had emigrated from Scotland. His family settled in Quebec, but he ran away from home and struck off from the California goldfields. Like many other miners, he later traveled north to the Cariboo, where he would have met MacDonald, his partner in Pemberton. Returning south, Curry passed through Clinton when the smallpox was raging and continued on to Lillooet. For a number of years after 1868, he farmed between Lillooet and Ashcroft, where he preempted land. In 1895, 10 years or more after Curry settled in Pemberton with his Lillooet wife, the federal government established a post office on his farm to serve settlers scattered throughout the valley and over Pemberton Portage. John Curry was a postmaster, handling the mail in a little log cabin building in which there was also a store. Willie Curry, John's second son, said that Andrew Joseph was the first of several mail carriers. The Currys had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. The trail from Squamish led travelers straight to Curry's door, where he would welcome them and invite them to stay overnight. Brought up from the abandoned steamer at the lake, the Currys' hardwood doors would be more elegant than the common homemade variety. But inside the walls of the addition to the original home were decorated with 1886 newspapers, which had been pasted there for insulation. Newspapers on the walls of the halfway house on Portage served as double purpose. One family used them as to play I Spy. As in most pioneer homes, the kitchen was the principal room, its wood stove topped with a steaming kettle. This stove provided heat, baked bread, heated water for washing and baths, and cooked the endless meals for the family and for all who happened in. Currie would have built a wood box close by, and a bench for pails of water hauled up from the well near the door. Not far away stood a long table, which was a work table and dining table combined. There his wife cut meat, kneaded bread, worked butter, and prepared and served meals. At night, lighted by a candle or a coal oil lamp, the table was a place where the family and visitors gathered to talk or read. Currie's grazing land stretched down to Green River and over the mountain on the west side of the valley. By 1891, he had 100 cattle and 6 horses. 6 years later, when his herd had grown considerably, he decided to drive most of the animals over the trail to Howe Sound, and no doubt skip them on to Vancouver. And because he would not be feeding much stock the next winter, he cut and stored much less hay than usual. He hired dozens of men from the Indian Reserve to help with the drive, but the cattle were quite unaccustomed to being herded and refused to stay on the trail. Currie then fenced sections of the path and tried again. But the animals still went their own ways, up the mountains or down the slough running into Green River, where many were mired and lost. Rain turned to snow, and in just a few days the temperature dropped to 18 degrees below. The drive was a complete failure, and Currie's supply of hay was far short of the needs of the few animals that did reach home. A.P. Barnum and his partner, both of whom would help with the drive, stayed with Currie and cut cottonwoods and willows to help feed the cattle. The animals would eat sticks as big as your finger, but the twigs and branches were no substitute for hay and grass. And in the winter of 1898, the snow lingered until April. Years later, white skeletons still littered the edges of the fields. Another early settler, Harvey Nelson, reached this region when a young boy, and in 1890 was on the list of Pemberton voters. He acquired land close to the rancherie, as the Indian Reserve was called. But when his house burned down, he located further up the Lillooet. Sharing his home with Lane Johnny from Skookumchuck, the Nelson farmland is now owned by Howard heirs, and is distinct from other land because of that lone old crabapple tree still standing in the middle of a field. On the old road to Mount Currie, the steep hill which overlooks the farm was named for Harvey Nelson. One of his descendants is Matilda Jim, a woman of more than 100 who still weaves baskets of fine quality. About the time of the first post office was established, 3 more men made their way into the valley: Carl Abraham Hartzell, William Morgan Jock Miller, and Duncan Morrison. Hartzell, a Swede, and Miller had both been at sea and had met in Vancouver, where they worked as longshoremen. Anita Ronan McWilliams describes Hartzell's voice as rising in excitement until he was almost singing. Wearing a beard and looking like King Oscar of Sweden, Hartzell sported a straw hat, summer and winter, and required outsized collars to stretch over a goiter he had developed. About 1891, he settled in the Sioux Valley, his Greta Valley, where others too invested. One was Sam Fedek's widow, who thought she was investing in the Pemberton country her husband had described after his return from the goldfields. From having seasoned and returned home with food, and after a few late springs, with their accompanying floods, which set his cabin boards awash, Hartzell settled in Pemberton. In the year of Currie's disastrous cattle drive, Hartzell was returning from the coast when a snowstorm caught him at Green Lake. In leather shoes, his feet were nearly frozen when he stumbled into Currie's house. Janet McCurdy took charge, pulling off his shoes and socks and bathing his feet. To protect his feet in later years, he would wrap them in strips of gunny sacking and pull on his own homemade moccasins, winter footwear, the very best for warmth. Hartzell had located beyond the rock slide and had built a log house with a roof extension to shelter his wood supply, and a loft above reached by a ladder. He plowed with oxen, one named Spot. But by the time Hartzell broke his land, nobody else beyond the rock slide owned a horse either. He planted a variety of crops, but the farming activity for which he's best remembered is raising pigs. One of his friends claimed that Hartzell had taught his pigs to eat clover roots under the snow, where they made tunnels with air holes, and that once he thought he'd lost a pair of pigs, but they had spent the winter eating culled potatoes along last season's potato rows, and had turned up grunting when the snow melted. Inside the cabin, like several other early Pemberton farmers, Hartzell carried on both scholarly and household activities. Besides working at endless mathematical problems, besides trying to square the circle, he kept weather records. Until 1904, when he succeeded Currie as postmaster, Hartzell would sometimes leave his farm for a time during the summer. Once he hiked 25 miles through Railroad Pass to Lorne Mine on Cadwallader Creek. In 1900, he made his diary entry: water over land in June, came home in July, crops and everything is all right. To simplify soup making, over the stove he hung a chunk of meat ready to be immersed in a pot of water boiled for an hour or more, then returned to its hook. Kathleen Ronan Lundgren remembered his third brew, which she, as a child, was allowed to sip: a wine brewed from currants, a first, a second, and a third time, the last brew proving less than potent. Some people remember his unique method of hanging out shirts and overalls to dry, spread-eagled and nailed to the wall. Ian Nicholson has vivid memories of Hartzell's efforts to interest officials, even the King of England, in exterminating the beaver whose dams were flooding his fields. After 1918, another ongoing problem was the contempt in which new settlers held for fences Hartzell had built across the public road to the north and south boundaries of his farm, as protection against straying cattle. Despite Hartzell's racing a mile between his gates to guard them, settlers maneuvered their cartwheels to damage the gate posts. Finally, Hartzell's recourse was to a shotgun. The settler to a justice of the peace. At the trial, held on a summer weekend at a table in front of Jack Ronan's house, everyone was there. Old Hartzell had a secret up his sleeve. The settler had been courting the teacher, and in the evenings they used to go to an old house on Hartzell's property. He comes on with this story, everyone laughs, and Jack Ronan dismisses the whole case. Hartzell was a man of strict code. He once sold his land, but when the buyer was unable to complete the payments, Carl Hartzell returned to Pemberton, took back the acreage, and as he was able, paid back the money he had received for the land. He was a most careful budgeter. His yearly supply of groceries would total $35, about the amount of his annual salary from the post office. One year, his expenditures exceeded this limit, and only after long calculations did he remember that during the year he had broken his lamp glass and had to replace it. Once, when he counted the matches in a new box, he found that it was short the usual number. When the local merchant disclaimed responsibility, Hartzell wrote to E.B. Eddy Company in Hull, and the firm sent him 2 small boxes. If he seemed to be penny pinching, he was also generous. Every Christmas he gave $1 to each child in the valley. At that time, a handsome gift. And he would continue to do so until the Green family arrived and brought the number of children up to 24. Will Miller settled near the creek to be named for him and his brother. In 1895, he had preempted a district lot. He had reached Pemberton long after he had left his home farm in Scotland, at the age of 16 to enlist in the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. He served in Africa and Ceylon. Later, as a seaman, he sailed several times to the British Columbia coast, and there, as a resident of early Vancouver, earned a reputation as a boxer and a wrestler, and as a captain of a tug-of-war team. Then he headed towards this valley, and on reaching Lillooet River, swam across to an uninhabited area. A few years later, Miller took part in one of the cattle drives organized to supply beef for Yukon gold miners. After the men in charge had overcome extreme difficulties and had herded the cattle as far as Teslin Lake, they found that thick ice had formed around the barges built to ferry the herd across the lake. The herders could do nothing but slaughter the cattle. Mining out of Outland, the Ronan brothers found and used some of the frozen beef, but of course had no idea that one of the men who had driven the cattle north would be their neighbor in Pemberton. Miller himself, after mining at Dawson Creek, walked on the ice along the Yukon River and across Norton Sound to Nome, Alaska. Throughout the winter, he had traveled about 1,500 miles. When he hiked back into Pemberton, he had his brother Bob with him. Within a few years, the brothers received crown grants to 2 district lots, adjoining the lot already owned by Will Miller, all near Miller Creek. There they cleared land and raised cattle, herded by a dog Leonard Neal had given them. About 1950, far out in what would have been a swamp, a much later owner of the land plowed up an ancient cedar fence, posts and rails that could have formed a corral. And the skeleton of Miller's barn still stood beside the creek, the remaining timbers still pegged together. Having packed an axle from the coast and having made the wheels from solid cottonwood, Bob Miller built the first wagon in Pemberton, and thereby eliminated the use of rawhide, and replaced the Go Devil, an rough all-wooden sleigh. When Jack Ronan wrote in April of 1909, Neal and Jock Miller firing, burning dead grass and bush, Bob Miller was already at the fish hatchery at Owl Creek. Not many months later, the brothers returned to Scotland for a visit, having by then started transfer of their property to the Howe Sound Northern Development Company. They signed a quitclaim deed in 1912. From their vantage point on the trail to the upper valley, the Millers had seen other settlers pass on their way to the post office on the Curry farm. Occasionally surveyors, timber cruisers, prospectors, and land seekers traveled into the valley. If not seeing them, the Millers knew of their passing. The print of a horseshoe indicated a visitor from the coast. Men were known by their footprints. One example of such keen observation, Clara Jones mentioned. One early fall day, Clara Jones' mother, Minnie Ryan, decided to walk about 6 miles down the trail to visit her sister, Mrs. Leonard Neal. She made herself a couple of sandwiches, and wearing running shoes, she started off. She got just past the rock slide and into the Miller timber when she rounded a curve in the road and came face to face with a big black bear sitting up eating berries from the bushes. Mother stopped dead in her tracks. The bear looked and then lumbered off into the bush. Mother said she just couldn't move, then thought of her lunch, put her hand in her pocket, brought out a sandwich, and ate it. Then went on. She was at Auntie's for about an hour when one of the Ronan brothers came in and said, "I see you met a bear, Mrs. Ryan." Mother looked amazed and asked how he knew. He laughed. "I saw the tracks. I knew you stood and never moved until you ate a lunch." One land seeker reached Pemberton very thirsty in the summer heat of 1897, and to the amusement of the people who regularly used river water, asked if the Lillooet water was fit to drink. The newcomer was Duncan Morrison, a tall, blue-eyed, gentle-mannered man. After acquiring his lonely ranch, where he believed trains would someday chug past, he would walk 15 miles to the post office down the road, which twisted its way back and forth across the valley floor, meandering like a river. Born in Cape Breton, he had left home, planning to prospect for gold in the Yukon. Some say he made his way into the valley working on the Pemberton Trail maintenance. His niece, Mrs. C.E. Carter, knows that at first he found life here very lonely, and she was not surprised to learn that he had once decided to leave this country and started to hike out through Railroad Pass, where a blizzard turned him back. She said, though, that in later years, the lovely valley was paradise to him. Most of the pioneers appeared to have developed no adverse effects from their isolation. A few may have suffered. One unfortunate bachelor resented his neighbors. The first had filled a sock with thistle seed, then strode up the trail, twirling the sock around his head to distribute the seeds on the unfortunate bachelor's land. Another had trained a crow to steal the bachelor's eggs, and a third came in the dark of the night to ride the bachelor's yet unbroken 8-year-old colt. Those few 19th century settlers lived as we do, facing Mount Curry, which is named for the pioneer who farmed below it, in all its shifting colors, from snowy white and blue to summer green and blue. That mountain is the prominent landmark, unchanged for over centuries, except for some logged patches on its lower flanks. And when the first snow falls at 8,000 feet, Old Man Curry puts on his nightcap, and John Curry Mountain begins smoking all day in the winter, as if to vie with the chimneys in the valley.